Welcome to another episode from Classic Car TV. We've not been on the air for a while, but that doesn't mean that nothing's been happening. There's in fact been quite a lot going on in the background, more of which you'll see in the coming months. Now, up until now, we've covered classics, modern classics, all sorts of cars from MGs to Porsches, McLarens, Ferraris and much more. But one car we haven't covered so far is Lotus, and we're about to put that right. Now, it's not the beautiful blue Elan behind me at the moment that we're featuring now, although that should feature in an episode coming up soon. Now, I've met somebody who's loved Lotuses for a long time and who today owns a few Lotus cars. Recently, he's commissioned the car that's going to be the subject of this new series, but more of that in a minute. Now, we all know that the S1 Elise is a fantastic car, so much so that Pistonheads readers voted it officially the best sports car of the last 25 years. That's quite an accolade. I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time driving S1 Elises, and I completely agree. They're absolutely epic. They're so good, why would you ever want to change one? But that's just it. The Lotus Elise is a car for enthusiasts, and enthusiasts love to modify their cars, whether it's making them go faster, handle or stop better, or maybe just look different. I found one company that's turned this into a fine art. That's Analogue Automotive, based in Fernhurst here in the UK. It's run by Stefan Dobka. I first met Analogue and Stefan when I needed a few jobs done on a Lotus. Those few jobs have turned into one big project. After working as an Elise S1 specialist for quite a few years, Stefan decided to take the S1 onto the next level. He's developed something called the SuperSport. Now, that's an Elise S1 that's been enhanced, reimagined. You could draw a parallel and say that the SuperSport is to the S1 what a Singer Classic is to the 964 911. I don't think Stefan would mind me drawing that comparison. Both John Barker for Evo and Henry Catchpole for Haggerty have reviewed the SuperSport and given it rave reviews. Anyway, the exciting news is that a SuperSport has been commissioned, and I get to make a Classic Car TV series about the project from beginning to end. In this first episode, we talk to Stefan, and we learn a little bit about the history of his company and why he decided to gild the Lotus Lily. Then we work our way into the project, from the sourcing of the car and into the breakdown process. Through the rest of the series, we'll look at engine development, suspension options, wide track or standard track, and just what happens when you break an Elise S1 down into its component parts and then put it back together again. So let's kick off then. But just before we do that, I'll give you a bit of background. Quite often on these jobs I have a camera crew, soundmen, cameramen, etc. But I didn't have that for this first episode. So the interview with Stefan will be seen with me on the back of the camera. That could change in the next episode, we'll see. Anyway, let's get off to Analogue Automotive.
Analogue Automotive, I started in 2012 after a run of working with a few other guys and owning several Elises, mainly as a Lotus specialist, restoring, at that time probably more maintenance and sort of track day focused. As the Elises got on in age, we've got more into restoration and modifications of them. Specialisation sort of twofold. We do a lot of restoration of Series 1 suspension work, and then also the SuperSport, which we launched last year, which is a sort of full resto mod, revised S1 Elise. Again, twofold. We do a lot of restoration work, and while doing that restoration work, typically we improve on the way it came out of the factory, particularly on things like finishes. The wishbones, instead of just being poorly zinc plated, we sort of do a 3-stage powder coat, so we refinish some of those parts to a higher standard. That sort of led us on to improving dampers, a lot of aftermarket dampers that are better than the original factory dampers. So the suspension as a whole can be improved on, and then we start looking at other areas. So for instance, when it needs repainting, factory paint's all well and good, but you can do better. If you start amplifying that through every part of the car, you end up with something that is generally a lot better than it came out of the factory in the first place. Yeah, again, two reasons for that. One is that the cars are coming to an age where they can be exported to countries that never had them in the first place. So typically the UK and Europe had the Series 1, the rest of the world didn't, particularly, for example, the States didn't meet the legislation at that time. Now with the 25-year rule that's in many countries, we're able to export them to those countries, but one of the conditions is the original chassis and the engine, so an engine swapped car wouldn't sort of pass those regulations for getting it in. So we've stuck with the K-Series. Also, we're quite a big fan of the K-Series. It's a light engine. It's been around long enough to get over some of the gremlins it used to have, and with some performance parts now you can almost double its horsepower from the standard car, again amplifying what it was able to do in the 90s from the factory. It used to have some head gasket issues, but as we've gone through time they've become less and less. Modern processes, modern head gaskets, modern means of controlling temperature have got over all those quite a few years ago, and enable us to run quite a reliable 200 horsepower in the SuperSport and more in some applications. So similar to a full restoration, we strip the car down to what we call a tub. So it's back down to the aluminium chassis with the bonded on side sills and screen surround. We allow a year. Generally it takes about 10 months, but we like to factor in a bit of spare time for any unforeseen, and obviously then shipping, quite as I said before, they go all over the world, so we need to factor that in. But yeah, if you place an order today, you'll get it this time next year. So yeah, typically a 12-month turnaround. And process-wise, we source as nice a car as we can, either from stock of cars we've already bought in, or if our customer has a particular preference, we go and source a car for them. Then we'll inspect it, generally make sure that the chassis is of a good enough quality that will come up like new. There's quite a lot of damaged cars there, or cars that are too heavily corroded to really start to get it to the level that we want to get it to, so we can be a bit picky about which cars we use. Alternatively, we can use a customer's car. Again, we'd need to see it and make sure that they're aware if there are any issues with it. And then we strip it, literally blow it into a million pieces, strip everything down to a bare tub, correct any issues corrosion-wise. Usually there's dissimilar metal issues, where the steel has maybe corroded and started to eat into aluminium. Usually that's very mild. There'll be some little nooks and crannies in the engine bay behind some of the the firewall where you can get some corrosion that you'd never see until you take the engine out and take some of the material out, so you can see what's what. But once we've got down to that blank canvas, then we start rebuilding with pretty much all new parts. The original donor car, we used the original chassis, aluminium chassis, the side sills which were bonded on from the factory, and the screen surround. We'll try and use as many of the body parts, original body parts, as possible, so the fiberglass body shell, and then we'll use the driver and passenger window glass. Everything else is pretty much replaced. There might be a few small brackets that will powder coat, etc., but most stuff is from there onwards. Brand new engine, gearbox casings we use, but also inside the gearbox is all brand new, all new wishbones, literally. Yeah, so it will be a new car. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we actively encourage that. It's a bespoke project and a product, so it's really down to the customer. Obviously things like colour. There's spec in engine choices they can go from, interior choices of colour, etc. And then yeah, there's various, how much carbon we use. Do we go original? So there's some customers that will go more modern route with a lot of carbon. Other ones will want to go slightly more traditional and have the interior in leather as it was out of the factory. But yeah, very much a bespoke product, so whatever the customer wants really. We have our own thoughts on suspension, so we have our own on the SuperSport dampers that we've sprung right and damping wise got just to how we suggest it's done. But again, if some customers maybe going to use it more track biased, then we'll move away from a road setup or vice versa. So again, it depends how the customer uses it. So the customers will choose obviously the niceties about colour and finish, but also we do have a discussion about how they're going to use it. Majority of the SuperSport is aimed at being a very good fast road car. It's not designed to be a track car, although it does do track work very well. If a customer is slightly more leaning towards a more track-based car, then obviously we'd adjust the suspension, particularly like the dampers. We'd go for a slightly stiffer spring setup for track work. The two biggest ones I would say would be engine spec. So we have a 160 spec engine, or the 210 horsepower in the SuperSport. And then suspension-wise, we have the standard track suspension, or we do our wide track, which is wider wishbones and a wider track, and that's complemented with some different dampers. So it would mainly be engine. You've got choice there, and also on the suspension side of things. On the other option, although it's something that naturally comes, is the weight saving. Our wishbones for the wider track is actually ends up being a lighter suspension arm, so there's a bit of weight saving there as well. So there's a few different options, but I'd say the engine choice and suspension, whether it's narrow or wide track, would be the two biggest ones. With the advent of the sort of 25-year rule, which is different in different countries, some are 30, some are 15. The Series 1, as I said earlier, was predominantly a UK and European car. So now we're getting a lot of interest. I would say 80% of our business is for exporting it to countries that never had the S1. The Elise, and also, which we will call the Motorsport, will be the S1 Exige as well, which is obviously it's almost a supercar in some countries. They didn't have it. It was a bit of a poster car for the States, for example, so they seem to go nuts for S1 Exiges. And very much a worldwide product now, rather than just something that was for the UK, and that is off the back of this sort of legislation that an older car over 25 years old is allowed to go to countries, and it doesn't have quite as stringent emissions and safety regulations that a newer car does. At the moment, of the current builds we have in, 80% of those are for going abroad. So there is a UK market, but the UK has probably got a bit more used to seeing an Elise. If we stand outside the front of our workshop for long enough, you'll probably see a Lotus or an Elise drive past. Whereas in other parts of the world, they're a real rarity, so they're sort of maybe held in slightly more esteem. And those sort of countries probably don't want a 25-year-old untouched car. They'll want something that's restored, and either restored as close as new or modified in some cases. Yeah, definitely encouraged. As I said, it's a bespoke product, so there's sort of an interchange of ideas, and whether that's in the spec process early on or colour choice, etc. I draw the line at them actually coming down and helping, but we encourage them to come down and see it through the stages. So, obviously they'll see the car as it was. If they're local or they come and visit in the UK, they come see the car before we start, maybe even drive it before we start, so they get sort of an A/B test. And then as the process goes on, we usually, at any key points, we'll sort of inform them and maybe invite them down to see. So for instance, with this client's car here, it's at a stage where all the wishbones, clams are off. You can see sort of down to the nitty gritty, but still in its original form, so it's fairly dirty. I think that's good to see it in its original state, and then in its sort of cleaned, restored state. It sort of helps the customer to appreciate where their money's gone. So excluding a donor car, because the prices on those are variable, they seem to be going on the upwards trajectory anyway. Approximately £100,000 for the restoration and modification work. There are some variables, whether we do a left-hand drive conversion adds to that, some of the carbon options. So we've had customers that have spent considerably more, and some that have had their own car and probably spent a bit less because it was a good car in the first place. So it is a little bit how long is a piece of string, but as a rough guide, I say sort of 100k is a starting budget.
I hope you've enjoyed part one of the Building a SuperSport series. In the next part, we'll look at the donor car. What year to go for? Is mileage important? How important is condition? And what are you looking for when you examine a car? How much should a suitable donor car cost? And of course, we'll present the actual donor Elise, this grey car. Why did we choose this particular car? So make sure you're subscribed, and I look forward to seeing you in episode 2.